Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm President and CEO of ENO. And as always, let me extend my best wishes and hopes that you and yours are staying safe and healthy. Today's webinar is focused on our new ENO report, Congestion Pricing in the United States, Principles for Developing a Viable Program to Advance Sustainability and Equity Goals. I am joined, at least virtually here, by my co-authors, Martha Ruskowski and Brianne Eby. Martha is principal at Further Strategies, a consulting firm focused on advancing sustainable mobility and equitable access. And Brianne is a senior policy analyst here at ENO. Over the course of the next half hour or so, we're going to walk through some of the highlights in the report. Martha will discuss the framing and the approach, and Brianne is going to discuss each of the principles in turn. And after our remarks, we will engage in some Q&A with the participants. For those joining us live, you can submit questions anytime using the questions function on the webinar website there. You don't have to wait until we are done to submit questions. Folks are probably familiar with the concept of congestion pricing, where drivers are charged a fee to access heavily used roadways, usually during the busiest times of day or escalating during the busiest times of the day. The charge is intended to reduce congestion by encouraging drivers not to drive during the busiest times, or to switch to other modes of travel or other routes. And doing so can help reduce the negative effects of traffic, air pollution and carbon emissions, or road damage and traffic crashes. And when it's done right, it can help address the systemic inequities that are inherent in transportation. Obviously, the public health crisis has upended transportation in cities and metropolitan areas across the United States and around the world. And while the vast majority of places have seen congestion largely disappear, as the American economy slowly comes back to life, we are also seeing traffic slowly reemerge. Perhaps you've even seen it in your own city, your own metropolitan area. And we do think it's clear that the reasons for pursuing congestion pricing will not disappear once the crisis abates. Cleaner air, better access, and a more efficient transportation network are always going to remain top priorities in major cities and metropolitan areas. We think pursuing these goals may actually even become more important, as it will certainly take time for transit agencies, for example, to rebound after losing considerable fares, revenues, and ridership due to the crisis. In fact, the post-COVID world may actually see increased traffic congestion if previous transit customers are slow to return, or if they're fearful of contact with other passengers and they turn to private automobiles instead. Next slide, please. So congestion pricing takes several forms and is actually used in many other industries and sectors, but for our purposes, we're talking about two things. One is cordon or area-wide pricing, where a fee is charged for any vehicle that enters a defined geographic area, usually a city center, during the peak hours. Cordon charges are famously used internationally in places like Singapore, Stockholm, Milan, and London. And while no US cities have it in place, New York City is preparing to initiate one in Manhattan, hopefully next year. The other common form of congestion pricing is fees or tolls on discrete corridors or on parts of roads. And in the United States, we know these often as high occupancy toll lanes, where motorists are charged if the number of passengers in a vehicle is below a certain threshold, usually 2 or 3 people. They're used in several metropolitan areas around the United States, including here in Northern Virginia, where the prices actually vary based on the demand for the roadway. Congestion pricing has pretty much worked everywhere around the world where it's been tried, which is why we think many cities and metropolitan areas in the United States are still seriously considering its application today. So the purpose of the report is not to replicate the extensive literature and analysis that already exists on congestion pricing. Rather, we want to address in this report the political, institutional, and communication hurdles, which we think are still the most significant barriers to congestion pricing today. Next slide, please. What I want to do now is to turn it over to Martha, who's going to talk a little bit more about the framing for the work and how this fits into an overall sustainability and equity agenda. Martha?
Thank you, Rob. I'm happy to be here. So I want to tell you a really quick story. I was at a party at about 18 months ago, back when we had parties, with a bunch of friends who work in transportation. And I mentioned this project that I was exploring congestion pricing. And there was just this spark of electricity and excitement among these transportation nerds. They're like, oh, congestion pricing. And I think that comes from a growing realization that as we work to tip the scale to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to reduce trips, we need to add the disincentives to driving, the pricing signals that can accompany the work to create the incentives around better bike lanes, improved transit, if we're really going to be successful in mode shift. So I will say, though, that congestion pricing is not a cure-all. It's relevant, it's potentially powerful, but it's just one tool among this toolbox of work that we are advancing and deploying in our cities. And as Rob said, in framing this project, we realized that advancing congestion pricing in the United States is more of a political problem than a technical problem. And one of the people who understands that dynamic is Daryl Young, who leads the Sustainable Cities work at the Summit Foundation. So Summit stepped up to support this project at Eno to provide what we hope is a helpful framework to understand and address the political, institutional, and communication hurdles around the concept in the United States. So next slide. So to develop these principles, we interviewed people across a broad array of what we think of as the local leadership group that's essential to advancing congestion pricing in the US context. So we talked to elected officials, agency staff, advocates who are working on coalition building and community organizing. We talked to business leaders in the communities. We talked to funders and academics. So we asked them about the challenges and opportunities to help understand the local landscape. The principles were also informed by a study tour that we led last fall, along with Bloomberg Philanthropies, American Cities Climate Challenge, and the Barr Foundation. So we helped leaders from 7 different US cities explore systems in Stockholm and London so they could learn from the experts there and then discuss and debate how those lessons applied, again, in our own unique context here in this country. So based on what we heard and learned, along with literature review, we crafted this report. It offers 10 principles to help guide the work of those teams of local leaders in communities as they explore congestion pricing. So now Brianne Eby will take you on a quick tour of the principles and also describe some examples of those principles in action in places that have already adopted congestion pricing or where they're on the path to implementing it. Brianne?
Great, thank you so much, Martha and Rob, for introducing us. So for the next few minutes, I will walk through the 10 principles that we put together in this report, and I'll provide examples of each of those in action in cities around the world. And these principles and the examples are all pulled directly from the report. So if you'd like more information on any of them, as we won't be able to get into full detail today, you can read more there. And I also just want to highlight that the principles are very much meant to be able to stand alone, but they're also interconnected. So you'll find if you read the report that we were very deliberate about making it so that if you pick up the thread on one of the principles, it cross-references others. And so I'll start here with principle 1, situate the policy within a clear vision and purpose. This one was first for a reason, and we felt that it is important for congestion pricing to be rooted in a clear vision before it's considered as a potential policy anywhere. So places that have a clear purpose for pursuing congestion pricing and the goals that they want to achieve are more likely to obtain a broad base of support for the policy. The main outcome is of course to mitigate congestion, but this can achieve a variety of downstream policy goals of improving air quality, helping to achieve climate goals, and promoting social equality. These goals might be a part of the city's ultimate vision for pursuing the charge. So for example, we found on the study tour and then also in interviews that we conducted that the policy in London was introduced as a means to decongest the urban core to maintain economic competitiveness in London and across the UK. Here in the US, New York City's proposed congestion pricing policy is aimed at improving the transit system there. And then in San Francisco, where there's a policy currently being studied, they're focusing on facilitating mobility and accessibility for all. And so their Treasure Island Mobility Management Program lists equity as one of the primary elements of its congestion pricing program. Principle 2, so ensure a rational nexus between the revenue and spending. So while there may be a temptation to explore congestion pricing as a tool to shore up general budgets, especially right now in the current COVID context, when transportation agencies are taking hits across the country. We feel, and what we say in this principle is that while congestion pricing is going to generate revenue, that revenue should go back into the programs that ultimately benefit the program. So, for example, improving non-single occupancy vehicle mobility options. So, this might look like investing in transit, as I mentioned. Obviously New York is doing that, but we're also seeing in Los Angeles, there's discussion of using the revenue to fund fare-free transit. It might also look like investing in other transportation demand management strategies. So the toll lanes in Northern Virginia that Rob mentioned at the beginning, they've invested program revenues into walking and biking infrastructure and services like bike share. Principle 3, improve mobility options to provide choices. So in order for people to be able to opt out of paying the charge, there must be viable transportation options available. Regardless of whether these options already exist or if they must be improved with the revenue generated from congestion pricing, it must be made clear to commuters that the goal of congestion pricing is to improve mobility options. So for example, in Stockholm, ahead of implementing congestion pricing, that city added 16 new bus lines and also added additional capacity onto its existing transit. Similarly, in London, 300 new buses were added prior to the start of the congestion charge, and they made other improvements to transit. So both cities were ready to go from day one. Principle 4, create fair programs. This is an important one. So compared with other cities, the US certainly has a deep history of inequity with respect to income, health, race. In transportation, this manifests as a lack of access to opportunity. So how can congestion pricing help to address that lack of access to opportunity? I think there's an understandable fear that congestion pricing will exacerbate these inequalities by charging those without means, while those who can afford to pay the charge will continue to drive. But this assumes that the other elements of our current transportation system are fair. But really they're not. So things like gas taxes, parking charges, and sales taxes all burden low-income citizens. So again, the idea here is to reinvest in options that will improve mobility for all. One example of this, and I should say too, this is both equity in terms of the process of how congestion pricing is designed, but then also the policy itself. So an example of a more equitable process in Portland is they have a pricing for equitable mobility task force that's represents diverse perspectives and is helping to inform the decision makers on how the policy takes shape. And then an example of making the policy itself more equitable is New York's plan to provide tax credits equal to the toll amount for low-income households. Moving on to principle 5, build cross-sector partnerships. So building a strong congestion pricing program requires input and collaboration from civic, corporate, and political leaders. Elected officials will need a strong backing from these groups in order to champion the issue. So in London, one of the things we saw is that then Mayor-elect Ken Livingstone ran for mayor on a slogan of getting London moving and continued to support the program once in office. And he was really, a big champion of the program there. One of the things we found in our interviews for this report was that to get support from political leaders in New York City and state, there was both grassroots organizing from transit advocates to generate support among citizens, but also grass tops advocacy led by a coalition of organizers that pushed their political leaders. Principle 6, communicate transparently and strategically. So the idea here is that congestion pricing can be, incredibly complex and new to a lot of people. So citizens and leaders will be more likely to support the policy if the information that comes out about it is clear and concise. This information should convey the benefits and the details of how travelers can prepare for the changes. A good example of this was in London ahead of its rollout. Transport for London, which is the agency that administered the charge, formed a media relations team of outside experts embedded within the agency. And this team devised a 3-phase rollout of messaging strategies so that the public was not overwhelmed with all this new information about a complicated program. Principle 7, build a strong foundation first. A certain set of circumstances, preparation, and preconditions, so coalition building, for example, should be in place before going full speed ahead on congestion pricing. a pricing portfolio can be built incrementally through things like data collection, outreach, and pilot programs. So one of the key factors in Stockholm's success in their congestion pricing program was that they led a 7-month pilot program. And ahead of that pilot program, it wasn't really popular among citizens and residents, but once they saw the effects and the benefits of the program, that really helped to garner up a lot more support for it. So, conducting a full-scale pilot of congestion pricing is difficult, but I think it carries a lot of benefits as well. But, we can also see cities conduct pilots of related policies. So while an example of this is demand-based parking pricing in Washington, D.C. And while that was not directly in service of congestion pricing, I think it, is something that can help to sort of tee up a more expansive program. Principle 8, commit to transparency with performance targets. So quantitative assessment can measure congestion pricing's progress in meeting the stated goals and can help to document the success of the program. Primary metrics should, of course, be delays attributed to congestion, but things like increased transit ridership or decreased pollution are also important to document and can help decision makers plan for the future of the policy. And it's interesting to sift through London's impact monitoring reports from the early years of their program to see how it performed, in terms of some of these metrics. So I think that's a good example there. But Stockholm also published trial results and distributed these pretty widely to their residents to show how the program was performing. Principle 9, limit exemptions to essential services only. So there can be a temptation to exempt certain groups, for example, drivers of electric vehicles or low-income drivers from paying the charge. However, too many exemptions can counteract the revenue-generating ability of a congestion charge and can ultimately undermine its ability to reduce congestion. A better approach might be to initially apply a discount, but then sunset the discount after a period of time, or to provide discounts on multimodal options like transit and car sharing instead. An example of this in action was in London. Initially, clean vehicles were exempt from paying the charge, but the benefit was removed when it became too successful and ultimately resulted in an increase in congestion. And the final principle is to be nimble. So, the world is constantly changing and congestion pricing programs should be designed to change to reflect new technologies, demographics, external factors like climate change, and policy priorities. So some examples of this are, while this is not implemented, researchers in London have called for a shift toward a more distance-based charge and other platform changes. Another good example is here in the US, the I-66 toll lanes in Northern Virginia. They allocate revenue to different projects with each fiscal year. So ultimately taking a nimble approach to allow the policy to be adaptable. So with that, I think we will turn it over to Q&A.
That's great. Thanks, Brianne. Thank you, Martha. I've taken myself off mute here. So as it was great, great overview of the principles, and thank you all for the questions that are pouring in now. Let me try to bucket some of these together and kind of paraphrase what I think seems to be on the minds of a lot of questioners right now, and it relates to the current situation. And I talked a little bit about this at the very beginning, where we do think that that this is actually a good time to be doing this. It may seem counterintuitive that with no congestion, that this is not the time to be talking about congestion price. But we do think that as things go back, we're already seeing congestion creep up again, that this is the time where you can start to put things in place. And so folks have asked questions about the current situation. Unemployment's at 15%. Folks are working from home or working remotely. Those who are able to do so. For Brianne and Martha, do you think that the changes or the current situation has kind of overtaken the push for congestion pricing? Have the events that we're going through right now just made this conversation completely different?
Yeah, I'll start. And we addressed this briefly in the report. I think as you mentioned at the top, Rob, there's many reasons to think that congestion is going to return once the current COVID crisis abates. And I think, there is plenty of impetus to think that this might not be a good moment to continue to discuss this policy. But I also think that the current crisis should strengthen those reasons for pursuing it, because if traffic does resume, then I think it's going to be in full force, and the reasons for pursuing this policy are simply not going to go away. Martha, do you have any thoughts?
I do. I agree with you both. I've also been thinking about, what does recovery look like? We know that, like, I am 100% sure that transit will recover, that cities are here to stay, that there are just too many benefits of living in cities that we're not going to see this wholesale hollowing out of cities. Transit will recover because we need transit. There's nothing that is as efficient at carrying a lot of people. What we don't know is the recovery path for transit, how long that will take, what protocols we put in place, how efficient we can make transit when we have to do more distancing, more cleaning of buses. So into that void comes, the scary possibility of people just opting to more single occupant vehicles in their protective bubble of social distancing, automatic. But reality is that downtowns can't really handle more cars than they did pre-pandemic. So into that mix, I think we'll also see more people turning to bikes, which we've also seen. I think we'll see cities trying to create more recovery networks of bike lanes, perhaps to ease some of the pressure on transit lines, in busy cities as you get closer to crowded downtowns. So in all of that mix, I do think the need to manage traffic, to manage congestion, and frankly, the financial realities that we're going to be facing going forward as city budgets are slashed. I think in that whole mix, we're going to see pricing on the table as well as trying to make the alternatives work better. That's my quick
Right.
overview.
Yep. I was talking and I had myself still on mute. You'd think I'd figure this out by now. The next couple of questions seem to kind of build off that, and it's related to this kind of where we started a little bit. That as we assert that the major opposition or the major barriers aren't technical, right? It's not trying to figure it out. We know that this works around the world. We know generally how to do it. It's going to look different in every place. But folks are wondering so if it's such a great idea, then what is the delay? Why isn't this being done in places around the United States? As Brianne noted, there are studies that are happening in, I think, a dozen cities in the United States. New York's plan looked like it was going to be in place next year. Now, because of events, it may or may not happen on time. But how do you summarize what then the major opposition is in the United States to congestion pricing?
I think a lot of it is lack of familiarity. I mean, this is a new concept. Many Americans are familiar with toll lanes, other forms of pricing. Like I showed the example of dynamic parking pricing in Washington, D.C., but even that kind of policy is very new. So I think, at least from the user side or the driver's perspective, I think this is very much a new policy. And I think some of that does trickle up to leaders, decision makers, policymakers. So I think, at a very basic level, getting more information out and learning about this, whether it's through pilot programs or attempting, looking at other similar related policies, I think that's, kind of step one in learning about this.
Yeah, I would say, pricing is hard when you talk about disincentives and charging people to do things. That's a harder conversation than providing them with more options and alternatives. And yet we have examples across our universe of pricing and surge pricing. You pay more to get an airplane ticket 2 days before you fly than you do 2 months before you fly. You pay more to go to a movie theater at high volume times. So I do think we can do a better job of explaining these pricing concepts in ways that normalize them. The other big barrier that we see in the United States is the equity question, that whenever congestion pricing comes up, something you hear very quickly is, oh, it wouldn't be fair to poor people. And in this research and all these conversations have helped me understand that there's sort of two threads in there. One is leaders who genuinely care about the impacts on lower income people, especially with the suburbanization of poverty and other trends that we see in the bigger ecosystem. But the response there is okay, let's do the analysis. Let's look at the data to really understand who would be impacted by these pricing mechanisms, who is driving in, what jobs are they driving into, and then you can have the conversation around, okay, who should be made whole, or impacts to which populations do we really want to mitigate, and then be able to have that rational conversation around, move it from sort of this broad, like, oh, it wouldn't be fair, to saying, okay, not fair to who, and then how do we want to address this? Because you do have a pretty robust toolkit of ways to address those impacts. The second group that I see this from is, to put this sort of indelicately, it's people who don't like the idea in general of having congestion pricing, of being charged to drive, and they use this idea that it wouldn't be fair to poor people as a way to just not even have the conversation at all. So that's my, again, quick analysis of what I see as some of the biggest challenges around this.
And indeed, a couple of commenters, including some policy experts I know in Massachusetts, have commented, and specifically that in Massachusetts, the big concern is equity and fairness. Congestion pricing is punishing a little guy who's just trying to get to work. And so it is, I think, very pervasive. And it ties into another couple of questions here around the process. And we talk in the report about what they've done in San Francisco and other ways to make sure that this is a bottoms-up process that is inclusive of a range of different stakeholders. And then, frankly, I'll tell you from a bunch of these comments that folks are in, is skepticism, quite frankly, that there's truly a way to make sure that an equitable set of stakeholders are involved in the process. Can you say anything about that? How do you, what do we learn from how this has been implemented, and how you make sure that all voices are at the table?
So I'll start on this one. We took 30-some city leaders on the study tour to Stockholm and London, and they came up with a list of their 10 top takeaways, what they learned. And the number one thing that they put on the list was around process, and that you have to start early, both on the analysis, the data-driven piece, but also on the conversations with the many, many stakeholders that will be impacted by this. So I think that was a powerful conclusion that they came, a learning from the study tour, to ground it in starting early with the conversations and really be truly committed to a bottoms-up conversation. You can't just do the lip service that, oh, we're going to talk to everybody, and not actually do it. You will get caught out if you try to shortcut that piece of the equation.
Yeah, and I think I mean, this is certainly a prominent conversation right now in terms of the broader response to the COVID crisis, and how do cities look coming out of this in terms of urban design and being inclusive of diverse perspectives. So I think I'll just add that there's a lot of work being done in related fields, and so look to best practices in public health and in other fields for how to make sure that that everybody that needs to be at the table is at the table. And I think the example from Portland that I mentioned is a great one of this. So having task forces where constituents are informing their decision makers about this, I think that's a good model.
We're butting up against the time here, but if folks don't mind, I want to extend just a little bit, because there's two more sets of questions that keep coming up. I'll just try to bucket this together. One is around climate, right? And so, and we haven't really talked about revenues here, but that's obviously a big piece. It does generate revenue. We've talked about how it shouldn't be the primary goal, even though it clearly is the primary motivation in places like New York, with the money going into to shore up the MTA. But how do you make sure that the revenue from congestion pricing isn't going to make congestion worse, right? We have a pretty poor track record in a lot of places in this country of doing that. So how do you tie it into larger climate goals? Martha, maybe this is one for you.
I think doing that early foundational work with that leadership team of elected officials and local business leaders and your agency staff and folks from community groups who can really help bring those voices up and be clear on why you're doing this and where the revenues will be used. So the time to have that conversation is early, before people get excited about buckets of money, when in reality these programs don't generate huge buckets of money. You know, they are one piece of a funding equation. So bring those forward early, and I think if being clear on your goals will help justify where revenues will be spent.
Right, and that's the key. That was such a clear key lesson that we heard, especially from the international experts, that's saying that if you don't know why you're doing this, don't do it. If revenue is the reason to do it, don't do it. You have to have a broader purpose. That's how you bring folks in. That's how you focus and prioritize where the money eventually goes. We heard it very consistently through those other studies. And so the last bunch of questions is actually around that. Folks are wondering, I guess generally, United States is very unique in a lot of different ways. Even cities in the United States are different from one another. How applicable are those international cases to the United States? Folks were asking Brianne about the Stockholm referendum, for example. London has the new ultra low emission zone, for example. Governance is different in these places. You both were on the tour. How do you extract those international lessons and apply them in a U.S. context?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because, like you said, so many elements are really incredibly different between here and an international context. So I think this is more about just learning the general takeaways from how this worked elsewhere, and I think certainly it'll have to be tailored to each specific situation. So and that's kind of something that we discuss a little bit in the be nimble principle at the end. Nimble is both forward thinking in terms of adapting this policy to new technologies or new political situations in the future, but also be nimble in the approach that you employ. So we're not prescriptive about what congestion pricing looks like in any place. I think that's for each city or metropolitan area to think about. But yeah, I think take an open-minded approach and be willing to, glean the main lessons and takeaways from other places, but certainly tailor this to your specific place.
And I would add that, circling back to the climate front, the need to reduce transportation emissions, now the #1 single largest source of emissions in this country is rising to the top in awareness. And I think there's growing awareness that, yes, we need to electrify our fleet as much as possible, but we are also going to have to see a reduction in trips made if we are going to reach the 1.5 degree reduction by 2030 that has really galvanized the climate community. So there's interesting synergy with the move to low emission zones and zero emission zones. And we're seeing, the work to decarbonize freight delivery in particular, the whole chain from, cities to the local delivery and the large delivery companies, because I do think we will see increasing reliance on delivery going forward. So thinking about how congestion pricing weaves into low emission zones or zero emission zones, I think is really useful thinking in our cities that might help create some of that reason why. The other piece I would say The equity piece, people tend to always be frustrated when we go to Europe and we ask, how do you deal with the equity issues? And they kind of look at us with slightly blank stares. And I think it's because fundamentally, foundationally, they're addressing equity issues at a very different place in the chain, where their social safety nets are stronger. The way that they make sure to lift up the lowest folks in their communities, they're not forced, as we are, to be addressing them at the very end of these chains, like on congestion pricing. So those lessons aren't as applicable to the United States. The good news is that places like Portland and others are really figuring out how to address the equity issues. So there, we can't just plug and play from Europe. We have to figure it out here. We're trying to deal with big systemic issues and needing to deal with them on these, program by program.
Excellent answer. That's I think the key takeaway there is that it can't be. This is not going to solve all of these systemic problems that we have here in the United States, but you certainly can't make it worse. And if done right, it actually can make a very positive impact. And I know we're over, but I have to ask this one more question, just because it's, again, there's a bunch of these that tie together. I'll just read one specifically. It's about data. So what are the best data markers for successful congestion pricing? What should we be measuring? I ask this just because I recall this came up again over and over and over again. We have to make sure that we're measuring everything that we can, so we can know if we're doing it right.
Yeah, I can take that one. And I think looking at some of the studies that cities in the US are conducting right now and how they're measuring this, as those reports come out, I think that's one source where you might find these. So I'm thinking of, Seattle's, I don't know if San Francisco's is out yet, but you might, just keep an eye on the cities that are looking at this and look at how they're assessing it. But, certainly, as I said earlier in the presentation, traffic delays due to congestion or some other metric of congestion is a great thing to be assessing and the primary thing to be assessing. But even before that, I think figuring out different metrics to assess equity. So who are the potential populations that'll be affected, where, what certainly demographics, where do they live geographically, what are the transportation options that are available or that could be made available to them. And so, that'll certainly set this up for success. But then again, this kind of ties into the principle one about, setting a vision and goals and being clear about those. So if you're looking to hit certain climate targets, figuring out how to, measure emissions reduction. So I would tie the data to certainly broad goals and the overall goals of the program, but also what are you specifically trying to achieve in your city?
It all goes back to that first principle, figuring out what you want to achieve. So again, we're over time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and thank Brianne and Martha for the excellent comments, and thank you all for your participation. We didn't even come close to addressing a lot of the questions that are on here. Really just tremendous interest, obviously, in this work and congestion pricing in general. I would encourage folks, if we didn't get your question, the report is available on our website, along with a lot of collateral material. We have some videos that are shareable, that are kind of 101s on congestion pricing. We have some commentary and some other things that are up there. Take a look at that. It addresses some of these questions. We also cite in that report a lot of the other city-related reports that are out there. Folks have asked a lot about San Francisco and Seattle. Those reports are cited in there. I would encourage you to take a look at those as well, because they're very specific to those individual regions. And we're going to stay on top of this here at Eno, and with this whole network of folks. Look for future webinars where we're going to bring in some city-specific folks who can talk very precisely about what's going on in individual places. We actually talk here in kind of broader terms on this with some examples. They can get much down and specific into the details. So look out for that. And look out for all of our webinars coming up at Eno, especially our Road to the Recovery series. It's a series of webinars focused on leadership lessons and transportation strategies for our post-COVID future. The next one is next Wednesday. We'll be joined by Jennifer Almett, who leads the North American Development and Operations on behalf of Transurban. They run a lot of these HOT lanes around North America and other places, obviously related to what we're talking about here on pricing. Check out our website for info on all of that. And while you're there, check out and subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. So once again, many thanks to you all. Many thanks to Martha and Brianne for walking us through this. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks all.